Arrows fell before anyone heard the bows that released them. They hissed out of the gray English sky like a sudden storm, striking armored men with the dull crack of metal collapsing against bone. Knights who believed themselves untouchable stared in disbelief as shafts punched through visors, throats, and joints. No banners, no horns, no heroics. Just a single afternoon in which the age of chivalry died screaming beneath a rain of ash-colored feathers.
It began on a field soaked not yet with blood, but with cold morning rain. The French cavalry, proud, towering, wrapped in polished steel and centuries of noble dignity, waited on a gentle slope overlooking the muddy flats where the English formed a thin, ragged line. Those English archers, lean from hunger and hard campaigning, stood with their longbows unstrung at their feet, silent as trees in winter. They looked nothing like soldiers capable of reshaping the world in a single afternoon. Their commander, King Henry V, rode the line with a face carved from exhaustion and iron will. He had fewer men, far fewer, and every advisor knew what should happen that day. The French, confident and numerically overwhelming, were expected to crush him into the earth. Yet Henry knew something the French did not. He understood the weapon that had made shepherds into kings and farmhands into legends: the longbow. It was almost absurd in its simplicity. 6 feet of yew, a string waxed with tallow, and arrows as tall as a man's arm. But in the hands of an English archer, it became a force no armor in Europe could reliably withstand. The secret was not elegance or nobility. It was power, raw, brutal power, born of years spent pulling a bow until tendons grew like braided ropes beneath the skin. The French laughed at first. They always did. To them, the field was theirs, the day predetermined. Their armor glinted as if blessed by heaven itself. They joked about the English, calling them barefoot scarecrows, tired ghosts, soldiers only in name. They believed that once the charge began, nothing on earth could stop several thousand armored horses smashing downhill. They were right about horses, but not about the sky. Henry lifted his hand. The archers reached down, strings slipped over nocks, bows rose like a forest, suddenly remembering it could move. The air tightened as though the world itself sucked in its breath. Henry's hand fell, and the sky turned black. The longbows bent like living creatures, their cords thrumming with a violent heartbeat. Arrows launched with a sound like the ripping of the world's fabric, tens of thousands of them all at once. They climbed into the gray heavens, vanished for a heartbeat, and came down in a vast, rippling sheet of death. Knights looked up too late. The first volley struck. Arrowheads smashed into helmets and burst through visors. They punched into shoulders, slid under breastplates, shattered wrists gripping reins. Horses screamed and toppled, crushing riders before they even knew they'd been hit. The French line buckled, confusion rippling outward, as men who had trained their whole life for noble combat found themselves dying without ever lifting a sword. The second volley came before the first bodies touched the ground. Never had the world seen such speed, archers loosing 10, sometimes 12 arrows per minute. Their arms blurred, their eyes narrowed. They were machines of discipline and deadly rhythm. Mud splashed as arrows hammered the field like rain made of iron and fury. And still, the French charged. Desperation replaced arrogance in moments. Knights spurred their terrified horses, trying to outrun the storm, trying to reach the thin English line before their numbers dissolved entirely. They drove their mounts through the bodies of fallen comrades, through viscous mud, through the choking smell of torn flesh and panicked animals. But the ground was against them. The field had been soaked by days of rain. Knights weighed as much as modern motorcycles. Horses sank to their fetlocks, then their knees, slowed, stumbled, and fell under the weight of armor and the endless hail of arrows. Henry watched, without triumph. He had seen death before, too much of it, and he knew that no king should smile at slaughter. But he also knew he was witnessing the breaking of an age, the collapse of a world in which iron and lineage mattered more than skill and discipline. A third volley screamed downward. This time the arrows found joints already weakened, armor already cracked, visors already dented. They slipped beneath the plates as if guided by hunger. Men fell like waves collapsing on a shore. Some knights dropped their lances and tried to crawl, hands shaking, armor dragging them down like anchors. Others prayed, though the prayers drowned in the chaos. The archers did not slow. They stood in precise rows, loosing, stepping back, loosing again. Their faces revealed nothing, no joy, no pity, no fear. They were the storm, relentless and impartial, and the French, trapped in the churned, suffocating mud, were merely the earth that storm consumed. By the time the French vanguard reached Bow Range's end, they were no longer a vanguard at all, just scattered survivors staggering through a field that looked more like a grave than a battlefield. And still, the afternoon was young.
The French commanders shouted themselves hoarse, trying to restore order, but their voices vanished beneath the roar of collapsing cavalry and the ceaseless thunder of arrows. Messengers tried to ride forward with new orders, only to vanish in bursts of splintered armor and spraying mud. Every attempt to reorganize dissolved into the same nightmare. The instant a group tightened formation, the next volley tore it apart. To the men on the ground, it felt as though the English had found a way to weaponize the sky itself. What the French did not realize, what they did not want to realize, was that the English archers were not aiming at individual men. They loosed into the air, creating drifting storm fronts of lethal iron. Arrows descended its slopes that bypassed the strongest points of armor. The knights had spent fortunes crafting impenetrable breastplates, splendid gauntlets, and ornate shields. None of it mattered. The longbow did not care what a man's lineage was, or how many tournaments he had won, or how his family crest shone beneath the sun. Steel folded like parchment when struck by a heavy bodkin head falling from the heavens. For the first time in their lives, some French nobles felt something ancient and unfamiliar: helplessness. Behind the English line, the archers moved with a grim efficiency that bordered on ritual. They pulled new arrows from linen bags, stabbed them into the earth for speed, braced their feet, and fired again. Mud streaked their faces, rain clung to their lashes, their arms burned, but none of them stopped. Each man had trained from childhood for this moment. Every pull of the bow was a memory, years of drawing until fingers bled, of winter sessions that left muscles quivering, of fathers teaching sons that a longbowman's strength was carved, not gifted. They had become executioners of the old world. One French knight, Sir Alain de Faverolles, managed to fight his way forward through the chaos. His horse had been killed beneath him, but he clawed his way over bodies and broken spears, using sheer will to advance. Mud clung to his armor like a second skin.
An arrow protruded from the side of his helmet, the shaft snapping with every movement. Still he charged, screaming in defiance, demanding the dignity of close combat. He was 20 paces from the English line when 3 arrows struck him at once. One slammed into his throat, sliding perfectly between the layered plates. Another pierced the gap beneath his arm. The third struck his left knee, driving through mail and tendon. He crumpled without ceremony, falling face first into the mud, his sword sinking beside him. The English never even noticed him. He was just one more shape, disappearing into the heaving ground. By midday, the field had transformed into something unrecognizable, a mire of shattered armor, wounded horses thrashing in agony, and men drowning in mud too thick to escape. French survivors tried to retreat, but the weight of their own army trapped them. The second and third waves, unaware of the disaster unfolding ahead, continued pressing forward, only to collide with a wall of broken cavalry. Horses screamed and reared as riders cursed, shoved, and swung blindly, trying to make sense of the impossible. Some knights threw off helmets to breathe. Others tore away gauntlets to drag themselves forward faster. It didn't matter. They had entered a machine built for their destruction. Henry watched the unfolding carnage with a commander's cold clarity. Every moment of chaos across the French line strengthened his own. He did not need to charge. He did not need to gamble. All he needed was time, and the longbow bought him more than he could have dreamed of. Still, Henry knew that eventually the French, desperate beyond reason, would reach the English position. They were wounded, suffocating, terrified, but they were knights, trained to fight until the world turned red or dark. And so, when the battered remnants of the French vanguard finally staggered into striking distance, Henry nodded once. The English line surged forward. They did not present shining armor or glorious banners. They rushed out with axes, mallets, knives, and swords chipped from years of war. These were not duels fought beneath tournament pavilions. These were the final brutal minutes of men who had survived arrow storms and refused to die quietly. The English hacked at fallen knights trapped in their own armor, dragged others from the mud, and cut their throats to stop them rising again. The battlefield turned into a pit where chivalry had no place and mercy had no breath. Some French knights tried to surrender, raising trembling hands, voices cracking with pleas. But in the delirium of mud and death, surrender was nearly impossible to recognize. English soldiers, exhausted and half-mad from terror and hunger, struck down anyone who moved with intent they didn't understand. The mud drank deeply. Near the center of the field, Sir Jean de Mervel, a nobleman famed for his courage, found himself crawling beside his dying horse. His armor had filled with freezing sludge, weighing him down like a tomb. He looked up and saw an English archer approaching, bow slung, dagger drawn. Jean opened his mouth to beg for quarter, but the words drowned in the gurgling of blood from his pierced lung. The archer hesitated, not out of mercy, but out of exhaustion so profound he could barely lift his arm. Their eyes met for a long moment, the old world staring at the new. Then the archer drove the blade home. As the fighting compressed into brutal hand-to-hand chaos, the French army finally shattered. Men fled in every direction, slipping, falling, dragging crippled comrades through the muck. The arrows had broken their formation. The mud had broken their mobility. Now the English soldiers broke their will. Henry V did not cheer. He simply stood beneath the gray sky, rain mixing with blood on his helm, and whispered a single line that none around him could hear. "It is finished." The field answered with silence, broken only by the distant cries of dying horses. But the longbow was not finished yet. Far beyond the English line, the last reserve of French nobles, men who had not yet seen the horror, began to advance, still believing the day was theirs. They were walking into a graveyard. And the archers, who had watched the world crack open under their arrows, raised their bows once more.
The last French reserve advanced with a confidence built on distance. They had not witnessed the collapse, had not breathed the choking mud, had not felt the terrible weight of arrows falling with the cold indifference of fate. From their vantage, they still saw themselves as the salvation of the day, fresh, disciplined, untouched by the nightmare their comrades suffered. But as they marched closer, the truth emerged through the mist like a wound opening. Bodies lay in tangled heaps, armor twisted and ruptured, horses flattened into the mire as if swallowed by the earth itself. The ground no longer resembled soil, but a shifting, blood-darkened swamp. The air churned with smoke from shattered equipment, with the metallic tang of blood, with the low moans of men who no longer hoped for rescue. And standing against that apocalyptic backdrop were the English archers, silent, motionless, their bows raised one final time. For a moment, the French hesitated. That single moment sealed their fate. Henry V lifted his gauntleted hand once more. The archers drew. It was slower now. Their arms trembled, their fingers cramped, their breath rasped like old men in winter. But even in their exhaustion, they were instruments of devastation. They had one volley left in them, one final act to carve into history. The arrows flew. This time the sound was different. It was not the thunderous roar of the first volleys. It was a rasping, ragged exhalation, as if the bows themselves were sighing with the weight of what they had done. The shafts arced high, wavering slightly, then fell with the inevitability of judgment. The reserve line staggered. Men clutched at arrows jutting from shoulders, arms, and helmets. Horses panicked, throwing riders, thrashing in confusion as sharp iron rained into their ranks. Formations wavered, then dissolved entirely, as the French realized they were marching into the same hell that had consumed their vanguard. Another volley, weaker but still deadly, cut through the mist, and the French resolve broke. Panic spread like fire on dry grass. Some knights tried to turn their horses only to collide with comrades pressing forward. Others attempted to charge, but the mud seized their mounts instantly. Every movement felt like a decision between drowning and dying on a splintered arrow. The English, sensing the collapse, surged with new ferocity. Archers dropped their bows and snatched axes, maces, and war knives. Foot soldiers, grim and filthy, waded into the broken French ranks. The mud swallowed boots as they struck down knights too exhausted or shocked to defend themselves. Some archers fought with arrows clutched like daggers, stabbing through visor slits, the feathers quivering with each thrust. There was no formation, no elegance, no strategy. Only survival fed by desperation. Henry watched the carnage unfold with a hollow expression. He had achieved what many thought impossible. He had shattered the pride of French knighthood in a single afternoon. But his victory tasted like ashes. He saw the faces of dying men, some begging in languages he barely knew, others staring at him with hatred, others simply empty, resigned to the mud closing around them. The battle did not end with a final charge or a decisive clash. It ended with the slow drowning of hope.
French survivors crawled, limped, or fled into the deepening twilight, leaving behind armor too heavy to carry and comrades too wounded to save. Some knights removed their helmets and sat down in the mud, waiting for the English to reach them. They did not resist. They simply bowed their heads, surrendering to the new world rising before them. As evening crept over the field, Henry dismounted and walked the length of his battered line. The archers bowed their heads to him, though many could barely stand. Their hands were raw, their arms swollen, their faces streaked with rain and blood. They were exhausted beyond measure, but alive and victorious. "Your king thanks you," Henry said softly. It was all he could manage. They nodded, too drained to cheer. Behind him, the battlefield whispered, a grotesque chorus of groans, of horses gasping their last breaths, of armor cooling in the mist. Fires from discarded torches flickered across the muck, casting shifting shadows over the fallen. It looked like the end of an age. And in truth, it was. The afternoon that had begun with French nobles boasting of chivalry and glory had ended with those very ideals buried beneath thousands of arrows. The longbow had not merely defeated the knights, it had rendered them obsolete. No amount of lineage or armor or sacred ceremony could shield a man from the sky. War had changed. Henry knew that historians would speak of the victory as divine favor or tactical brilliance, but he understood the deeper truth. The world had witnessed the triumph of skill over status, endurance over vanity, and cold precision over noble tradition. The battlefield had crowned a new kind of warrior, not the mounted knight, but the disciplined archer, the common soldier whose strength came not from birth, but from labor. Night settled fully, swallowing the field in a shroud of gray. Henry stood alone for a long time, listening to the distant cries fade into silence. The moonlight glimmered off broken helms, shattered shields, and the still forms of men who had once believed themselves immortal. In that silence, he whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for forgiveness. Behind him, the English army began to move, gathering wounded comrades, collecting arrows that could still be used, tending fires that cast faint halos across the dead. They did not celebrate, they only endured, because victory had not brought them glory. It had only brought them tomorrow.